זה בסדר, בוקר טוב. הפאנל הזה הוא באנגלית, אז תחדדו את האוזניים ואני אעבור לשפה העיקה. Good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Van Leer Institute, but most importantly to this, I think, path-breaking conference on invisible work in Israel. And by the way, the rest of the session is going to be in prose, not in poetry, but I think that the prose that we'll produce is poetic in many profound senses of the term. We are grappling with how does one grasp the notion of an widespread invisible phenomenon, invisible work or invisible labor. How do we conceptualize it? How do we produce theories around the invisible that surrounds us? How do we recognize the various parameters and components and manifestations of invisible work? And frankly, once we've exposed the invisible in our midst, how do we deal with it? How do we incorporate it into our lives, into social policy, into action, and into profound social change? Now, these are amazing questions to ask about anything, but even more so when we're talking about something that we acknowledge ahead of time is invisible. Now, this day will be divided into three sections. This session is the hardest. It's the hardest because it will seek to deal with aspects of theorizing and conceptualizing invisible work. The second section is the most exciting in many ways, and that will deal with in-depth research that we've conducted over the years on how to recognize invisible work and what it entails. And the third section this afternoon is the most challenging because it seeks to address the question of what do we do about it. So that's the plan for today. It gets more and more exciting as we proceed, and we'll start with the conceptual and the theoretical. We always have assumed that invisible work in one form or another encompasses housework and care work. And we will deal this morning primarily, but not exclusively, at least in the opening presentation, with care work and also how it can be translated from worry into compassion. Interesting questions by any measure. The first speaker, and really we're delighted you took the trouble of leaving snow-ridden Toronto to arrive here, is by Professor Aimee Moullin of the University of Toronto, and she will talk about the ethics, from the ethics of care to a policy of care. She will speak no more than 30 minutes. She doesn't know me, but most of you do.
I'm committed.
And then we will hear from 3 discussants who will give their thoughts on the subject from, I have a feeling, quite different perspectives. Thank you very much, and Professor Mullen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the Van Leer Institute and to the Israeli Ministry of Science and Technology. And thank you also to the 2 other institutions whose names are in Hebrew, so I cannot read them. But especially thank you to my hosts. Thank you to all the scholars that I had a chance to engage with on Sunday at the workshop. And I look forward to engaging as well with you. I am not trying to make conclusions very broadly about in all ways how we can move an ethics of care into a kind of policy of care. I just have some remarks about one arena in which I think we can make some progress with respect to the ethics of care, which personally I prefer to call a theory of care, but that's neither here nor there. So the title of my talk is Care, Trust, and Betrayal, and I will now begin. Also, feel free to kind of go like this if you mean slow down. I will try to speak more slowly. So, what are the most important characteristics of an ethics of care? I think they are threefold. First, it is urgent that dependency and vulnerability are recognized and that needs are met not only minimally to sustain life, but also with recognition that someone can simultaneously require support and be capable of making contributions. While there are circumstances in which somebody receiving care cannot make any contributions, either the person providing the care or others more broadly, these are the exception rather than the rule. Social practices that shape the provision of care should aim to facilitate rather than thwart mutuality in the caring relationship. Second, that relationship, again, which is characterized by mutual valuing and mutual respect when it is done well, is ethically valuable, and the ability to be part of any such relationship is evidence of that's something that makes someone ethically considerable. The desire to give as well as to receive care is evidence of a relationship to others that goes beyond mere instrumentality and recognizes others as worthy not only of having their needs met, but also respect. Third, recognition of the first 2 characteristics of an ethics of care points to the importance of not only participating in caring relationships oneself, but also supporting rather than ignoring or undermining the ability of others to do so, and of attending to the inequities in distribution of both the provision and receipt of care. One of the most important features of a society that determines to what extent it will support and foster caring relationships and protect against their erosion concerns trust. More particularly, appropriate or justified interpersonal trust in others, both as individuals and in groups. Okay, fine. What do I mean by trust? This is a view I developed first in a paper I published back in 2005, in which I distinguished my understanding from views like those of Annette Beyer, a wonderful scholar. Her view was that trust involves assuming a person is competent with respect to a particular domain and assuming that they have goodwill towards you or what you have in your care. So I agree with her with respect to the competence, but you'll see I disagree with respect to the kind of generic goodwill. So what do I think? First of all, trust need not rise to the level of a belief, but is instead minimally an assumption that need not be made explicit either to the person or group trusted or to the person or group doing the trusting. In fact, sometimes we only discover that we trust when our trust is betrayed. The assumption involved is that the trusted entity, whether a person or a group, will behave not only predictably for who knows what reason, but is motivated to behave in the manner trusted for reasons shared by the one who trusts, and is competent to do so. It involves an assumption again of competence plus a shared norm relevant to the domain in which the trust occurs. So you don't have to think that the person shares all of your norms, just that whatever norm governs a particular domain, that they share that. Being trustworthy, therefore, contrasts with merely being reliable. Thus, for instance, we might trust members of our gym not to steal from us because of their commitment to the gym as a place where people go to become strong, healthy, and fit, rather than a place where strangers need to be on guard against one another. We might trust our co-workers to pull their weight on a common project, not because we think that they really love us, but because we think they care about the work we're doing together, care about doing good work, and are capable of doing it. We might trust a romantic partner to be considerate and loyal because of the importance we believe our partner places on our relationship and because we believe our partner is capable of being true to our shared commitment. In all of these instances, we are not assuming that the person we trust has some kind of generic goodwill towards us, but instead they are committed to a norm that we share and are capable of acting in accordance with that commitment. So, what makes trust appropriate or inappropriate? We might think that trust always involves going beyond the evidence that our expectations are justified, and trust always involves vulnerability to betrayal, so it either cannot be critiqued by naivete, or it's just always naive, and equally so. However, when we trust in the face of abundant evidence that our trust is misplaced, this is inappropriate. Furthermore, when we trust in a situation where the stakes are particularly high for vulnerable others, and fail to monitor even occasionally how well those vulnerable other people are faring, then trust is similarly unjustified. This is an important reminder that when we trust, we are not the only ones who can be damaged by betrayal of our trust. So most typically when we think of trust being betrayed, we think of the person who trusted being directly harmed by the person who betrayed that trust. So in the examples above, the trusting member of the gym gets robbed, the coworker gets let down, and the romantic partner experiences some kind of infidelity. However, very often when we trust, it is others who are harmed, whether because of a lack of motivation on the part of the person that we're trusting or a lack of competence. The following are all instances in which a third vulnerable party is more directly harmed by betrayal of trust than the person or group who trusts. 1. A parent trusts his toddler's babysit to be competent and motivated to do a good job, and in addition to share his understanding of what is involved in doing a good job looking after a child for an evening. 2. The managers and board of a large long-term care facility trust the doctors and nurses who check on patients regularly to be competent and motivated to provide high-quality health care in a manner that respects the patients and is informed by their perspectives and values. 3. The adults in a community trust that parents and children's other long-term caregivers are almost invariably competent and motivated to meet the needs of the children in their care. In the absence of compellingly obvious signs of abuse and neglect brought to the attention of public authorities, children's health and lives are left in the hands of their parents and those the parents hire to look after them. As we move from example 1 to 2 to 3, the entity doing the trusting gets broader. One parent, a group of senior employees, all the adults in a particular community. Similarly, the entity trusted gets larger. One babysitter hired for an evening, then all the medical staff working at a long-term care facility on an ongoing basis, or all the parents and long-term caregivers who look after young, dependent, and vulnerable children in a community. The consequences to the third party, the person or group who may not have had anything to do with trusting the babysitter, medical staff, and parents and caregivers, can be extremely significant. A betrayal of trust in a context in which we had expected care to be provided can range from a failure to recognize or meet the immediate needs of the vulnerable party, to a failure to appreciate what they value and seek as an outcome of their care, to abuse, uncaring neglect, and significant damage to long-term prospects and even death. If we all have a stake, as I think we do, in having people's needs for care met, especially the needs of people when they are at their most dependent and vulnerable, then what are the social policy implications of the high costs of betrayal of trust? In what follows, I focus on what I think is the most challenging case, which is of unpaid care, especially unpaid care happening in a private context, as we have more opportunities to prevent and monitor betrayal of trust in institutional contexts by means of social policy. Clearly, we want people to be better at trusting appropriately and not indiscriminately and in the face of considerable contrary evidence. Obviously, as well, we want people to do a better job at living up to others' trust, at least whenever the trust is properly placed. But these may not seem to be goals that could be achieved through social policy, at least when it comes to unpaid care. However, I think there are at least 3 ways in which we can develop policies that aim to minimize inappropriate trust and betrayal of appropriate trust in context of unpaid care work. These are, first, increasing the competence of care providers. Second, increasing the competence of those who monitor care provision. And third, increasing motivation to participate in meeting needs for care and/or ensuring those needs are met. As I observed above, competence is vitally important for appropriate trust or justified trust that others will meet our expectations. When we trust, we assume not only that others share goals that we have and intend to achieve outcomes that we endorse, but also that they are competent to do so. An important part of competence in the care context involves knowing what needs to be done and then how to do it. And both of these aspects can be enhanced by education. When it comes to trusting others to care, it's important that caregivers are well informed about the needs of those they care for, whether in an institution, in a private context for pay, or in unpaid care. Moreover, it is important that the competence not be restricted to some segment of the population capable of doing care work, but all of them. Because the demand that we respond to needs with care can come unexpectedly, particularly in unpaid contexts. For instance, men who have received care from their spouses for most of their lives may be suddenly or bit by bit confronted with their partner's own need for care. Moreover, education of children aimed at increasing the competence of all capable parties when it comes to detecting needs for care and understanding how to provide it may help to combat the unfortunately very unequal distribution of care work along gender lines. Globally, women do 2 to 10 times the unpaid care work that men perform. This is a 2014 study, so pretty recent. And this has significant impact on women's ability to participate in the paid workforce and also in demands on their time that increase levels of stress. As a 2014 OECD report on gender and unpaid care remarks, quote, "The day-to-day lives of women around the world share one important characteristic. Unpaid care work is seen as a female responsibility. Across all regions of the world, women spend on average between 3 and 6 hours daily on unpaid care responsibilities, while men spend between half an hour and 2 hours." This study defines unpaid care work as effortful, unpaid activity aimed at providing what people need for health, well-being, and protection. While it notes that as the income in a country increases, the disparity between the unpaid care work of men and women decreases, it also observes that it continues to be significant. So at the closest, women provide 2 hours, women provide 3 hours and men 2 daily. The study, in addition to educating boys and girls equally about the range of human needs, importance of responding respectfully to needs for care, and signs of abuse and neglect, it would be very useful, I think, to include statistics about the differing levels of unpaid care provided by men and women, as well as the fact that these differing levels are responsive to increases in income and gender equality of a country. Therefore, they need not be taken as inevitable, and the benefits as well as the burdens of care work should be highlighted. As an aside, I mention here that although I have focused on the importance of educating children about human needs, how they can be met, and the extent to which unpaid care work is currently unequally distributed, it is also important to ensure that men and women have equal opportunities to develop expertise in care work when their lives change. I therefore heartily endorse the proposal that a portion of parental leave be reserved for men or the partners of those who take the other portion of that leave, in case they are 2 women. So when the party with significant needs for care is unable to speak out if provided poor quality of care or if abused or neglected, it is also vital that all capable adults in the community be well informed about human needs at different stages of life and in different circumstances, so that everybody is able to recognize signs of poor or absent care. This should be an important and recurring aspect of the education that children receive in order to equip them to function in society, along with literacy, numeracy, and knowledge about their social and physical environment. Now, it might seem that any attempt to develop a public education curriculum connected to learning about the range and variety of human needs and how they can be met with care would be too contestable to be able to achieve widespread support. However, and maybe I'm just overly optimistic here, but I have seen some signs of it in some of my children's education, and I think we're more likely to find agreement about the nature of basic human needs than we are about visions of what makes for the best kinds of human lives. And any education about human needs must include recognition of the extent to which people's own projects and perspectives necessarily inform how their needs should be understood and met. Therefore, I'm relatively sanguine about the prospect of educational jurisdictions being able to develop a curriculum about human needs and care work that could receive widespread support. Now, as suggested above, education about human needs and how they can met can assist not only in improving the competence of people who do care work, but also the monitoring of others' care work. If monitoring is to be successful, then it is also important that people who need care, whether young children, people with illnesses and significant disabilities, or frail elders, interact on a regular basis with others beyond their caregivers, such that those others have the opportunity to observe failures of care. Now, while we could educate more social workers, and send them to private homes and care facilities. This would be expensive, invasive of privacy, and in all likelihood, home visits would be infrequent. Increased presence of social workers who provide oversight of care seems more appropriate to institutional care and less so to informal and often unpaid care provided in private homes. If any paid visits were to be supplemented or replaced by more informal interactions with the well-informed population who can recognize needs and signals that those needs are not being met, then a society can be more justified in trusting that caregivers are upholding the trust placed in them. In order for these informal interactions to increase in frequency, we would need to encourage a broad-based sense of responsibility, both for meeting needs for care and for detecting poor care, abuse, and neglect. Public education in primary and secondary school about human needs and the difference between respectfully provided and bare-bones care could not only enhance the likelihood of detections of failures of care, but also encourage the sense of community responsibility, in part by highlighting the extent to which abuse and neglect currently occur. And just as an aside, I have another paper in which I argue that we need to dispel certain myths about who are most likely to be targeted by child abuse and child neglect, and to kind of recognize what children's needs are more extensively, and also to have mechanisms for reporting suspicions of abuse and neglect that don't necessarily have to immediately trigger an investigation. And there's something like that was tried in Great Britain, for instance. Okay, back to my talk. Moreover, focus on isolation and loneliness could increase awareness of the extent to which human needs for social interaction do not disappear when needs for care increase. So people who do not engage in care work, paid or unpaid, and young children more generally, may have little to no understanding of the social aspect of care provision and of the extent to which this work can be rewarding. Providing care for another person should require engaging with him or her as a particular individual with a self-understanding and perspective that needs to be learned about and considered in delivery of care. This process of coming to understand another person and recognize that they are more than a bundle of needs can be a particularly enriching aspect of providing care, whether for young children, ill family members, elders in poor health in private homes, or the gamut of people in need of care in more institutional settings. Children's education about human needs and how to care for them would also benefit significantly from exposure to the voices and perspectives of people who do care work and people who receive it, whether through in-person visits, recorded videos, or in later years of school through more formal study. I mention one source of knowledge here, and that is Moscow and Martin's 2005 survey and analysis of over 1,000 Australian direct care workers, mainly women, over 90%, who care for elderly people as nurses, physiotherapists, and personal care workers. The direct carers frequently cite the caring relationships they form as an extremely rewarding aspect of their very poorly paid work. They mention the extent to which they appreciate and learn from the elderly people they cared for, noting the wisdom of care recipients, the stories they tell, and how recipients make workers feel valued and appreciated. Unsurprisingly, the workers also mention rigid time constraints on their work, which apportion a certain amount of time for each task, like showering, rather than recognizing the need to interact socially with the people they care for and learn what they need and have to offer, as a threat to the time they can spend attending to and interacting with those they care for. Learning from people who receive and people who provide care can encourage policymakers to recognize the importance of the social relationship between care workers and recipients, and ideally learning from these people while children are in school can inspire children, whatever their gender, to be motivated to do care work and to respect the work of those who do it, whether paid or unpaid. Education about human needs and how to meet them, especially if it includes hearing the voices and perspectives of people who do care work and people who receive it, could therefore increase not only competence with respect to providing and monitoring care, but also motivation or a sharing of norms around the importance of meeting needs for care and the responsibility we all have to do so. Thank you.